Thank you all for joining us today. My name's Anna Hyatt, and I'm covering Climate Now's executive editor. CC Now is honored to have partnered with the Solutions Journalism Network on the Climate Blueprint Project, which was born out of the Climate Changes Everything conference that our two organizations co-sponsored in September 2023. We're thrilled today to co-host this conversation about the power of local journalism with our SJN colleagues and the project's editor, Breanna Draxler. Throughout the hour, please share any questions you may have using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And later today, we'll be posting a recording of the webinar on our respective YouTube channels. Looking forward to the conversation, and over to you, Angela.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I want to echo Anna and our appreciation for the partnership between Solutions Journalism Network and Covering Climate Now. The Climate Blueprint was always meant as a living document, something that is iterative and added to as these important conversations continue. And that's why today the topic is so timely, as we're seeing the climate change narrative on a federal and international level become increasingly politicized, and funding for important climate projects stripped of their funding. Despite all of that, there's a lot happening on a local level, whether that's climate impacts like the increasing severity of natural disasters, but also when it comes to solutions as communities are working together to adapt and build resilience. So I'm very excited for this conversation with our panelists. But with that, I'll pass it to our moderator, Breanna Draxler, a climate and environmental journalist, most recently the deputy editor of Yes Magazine. And she was also the editor of the Climate Blueprint. Over to you, Breanna.
Thank you so much. I am really excited to have this conversation with you all, and I hope you as audience members are also ready to participate and ask some great questions, since that always enriches the conversation. In order for the story of global climate change to really hit home, we need to keep it local, and that's what we're here to talk about today, with three journalists who are particularly good at doing just that. We've got Camille Padilla Dalmau, the founder and CEO of Nueve Millones, an independent news network committed to amplifying the voices of Puerto Rican communities. She has been a multimedia journalist for more than a decade and has published stories on health and environmental justice on platforms such as Yes Magazine, Grist, and AJ+. Since 2021, she has been a solutions journalism educator and a certified Solutions Journalism Network trainer. Thank you so much for being here, Camille. We have Katie Myers, who reports on climate change in Appalachia through a partnership between Grist and Blue Ridge Public Radio in Western North Carolina. She previously served as a climate solutions fellow at Grist and as an economic transition reporter in Eastern Kentucky with the Ohio Valley Resource and WMMT 88.7 FM. Her freelance work has appeared in the BBC, NPR, Belt Magazine, and the New Republic, among others. And she's completed media fellowships with the Society for Environmental Journalists, the Heinrich Böll Foundation, America Amplified, and the Solutions Journalism Network. And finally, we have Emilie Stigliani, an editor who loves working with journalists to shape stories that provide local readers with insight and solutions to society's thorniest problems, including climate change. Prior to joining the Sacramento Bee, she spent 9 years working at the Burlington Free Press in Vermont, and she holds a master's degree in journalism from the University of Missouri. Please join me in giving all of our colleagues a warm virtual welcome. And so without further ado, here we are today. For better or worse, it's become a lot easier these days to see and feel the effects of climate change. The impacts are present almost everywhere. We can see Hurricane Erin, bringing the timeliness to this conversation. So the challenge for us as journalists is less about making a future scenario seem relevant right now, and more about connecting the dots between what people are experiencing on the ground and the larger climate trends. So for us as journalists, we are the storytellers, right? We're the ones doing the talking, but a key part of doing this work well is listening. And I wanna start off with you, Emilie, to talk about the role that listening plays in how you find climate stories and shape those stories for your local audience.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And thinking about listening, I think we as journalists, listening is sort of an inherent practice, but the important and maybe challenging part is who we listen to and how we invite people into that conversation. And And on the local level, you'll get maybe news releases from your local groups that are particularly involved in climate action, but there's not that many of them, at least here in Sacramento, and the ones that are there, they have their very engaged group of people. And I wanted to create content that got beyond that to people who maybe didn't think climate change affected them in any particular way. So as I started this project that became the foundation of what I learned and contributed in the climate blueprint, I started by interviewing a few people who I knew were involved in local climate actions. And then from there, I asked them who else they recommended that I talk to, and asked them particularly for people whose voices would not be immediately thought of. And that expanded my network way beyond people who were actively working on addressing climate change. And I think listening is sort of inherent to journalists. We're generally good at listening, but what you do with everything you've heard and listened, and you're listening and what you've heard and how you take that information in and organize it in a way to produce journalism and to shape stories, that gets a little bit more tricky. And that's where I can talk a little bit about squaring that with the climate action plan later. But I was really keeping track of, because I was talking to people who weren't necessarily framing their problems as a problem related to climate change, and keeping your spidey sense up on what they're seeing, what they're experiencing, what their concerns are, and then having to write that all down and think about how that would turn into a good story and also relate to climate change and one of the pressing issues. So it's sort of an organizational exercise as well as a listening exercise.
Absolutely. And I'd like to follow up on that idea, because you do your own reporting and you also guide a fair number of reporters in your newsroom as well. So how do you sort of organizationally or systemically ensure that you and your reporters are listening to different populations in the community and making sure that many different voices are accounted for when you're creating these stories?
Yeah, so for me, the system I created was one that I shared with my reporters that I was working with. And that was, as I was going through and having these conversations, I think I did, in crafting this project, I did 14 one-on-one conversations with different members of the community, all the way from a few people in high school to people who were retired, across all sorts of spectrums, people concerned about labor, people concerned about like United Latinos, different kind of affinity groups. And I started creating a database just for myself and for my reporters, where I took very careful notes on their name, what they felt uniquely qualified to speak about, whether they were willing to be seen as an expert or resource in a particular area, and just building that out and showing that to the reporters and having them build their own database. That was really helpful. So I got it started and they added and contributed to it over time.
That's really helpful to hear. And I think a big part of this listening to communities, stems from having relationships, having rapport established. And this is a central part of your approach to work, Camille. Can you describe the commitment that you made with one particular community and how it's shaped your coverage?
Yes. Thank you, Angela and Anna, for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, Breanna. So at 9 Millones, thanks to the Climate Beacon project of Solutions Journalism Network, we were able to develop a community outreach methodology, very much where the goal was to go from relationships to partnership. So we chose the community of Vieques, which is an island town to the east of the Puerto Rican archipelago, which we always highlight. Puerto Rico is an archipelago. We have hundreds of cays and islands. It's not just one island. And the island municipalities are two, Vieques and Culebra, and the coverage of those islands tends to be an afterthought at many times, or only when there's problems. So we thought it would be interesting to bring the solutions perspective to the island. And we started first by really researching and seeing what is out there, because we didn't want to have people repeat, the questions they've already been asked, right? So we want to do a regenerative type of storytelling where we consider that, people in Vieques in particularly, a place that was militarized for 60 years, where the military did bombing exercises. We know they've been through a lot of collective trauma, and how do we reach a community with that context in mind, right? And so after we kind of researched and did our context, we just started to talk to people, right? And identify who are the conveners. And what was really important for us was those listening sessions where we realized that, yes, like as Emilie says, listening is an integral part of journalism, but for some reason, and I think it has to do with the way mainstream media wants everything immediately and doesn't really give time to stories. They felt that journalists came with their own agenda, that they talked to the same people, and they didn't really ask the questions they wanted to answer, which for me, that was one of the most striking feedback we got, because then the question became, well, what are the questions that you want answered, and who better than people in a community to pose the questions, the investigations that journalists should pursue. And what was amazing is that we went there for needs assessment, to build relationships. There were times where we went there just to get to know people and not with, we have this story in mind. And then the story sprung up organically, and they were probably much better than if we had gone with, this is the story I want to tell, right? And this outreach allowed us to create partners. And one of the most beautiful outcomes is now members of those community are pitching stories, and descendants of Viequenses are looking at our stories, getting inspired and wanting to write about, their grandmother's place of living. And that was always the goal, that it wouldn't be that we tell these stories, but that we cultivate not only their relationship with community leaders, but the storytellers, so they know that we are an outlet that covers those stories.
That's really amazing. And one phrase I've heard you use, Camille, is rather than seeking a story, we're seeking understanding. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit to how that guides your newsroom, and in a world of deadlines and needing to fill space and needing to run a certain number of stories on a certain timeline, how does that shift when you're seeking understanding rather than just stories?
I find it very healing for all parties involved because when you seek understanding, it's almost like the practice of storytelling can become therapeutic in a way, because you give people all the time they need to tell their stories. And sometimes, especially people doing solutions, they're just, on the go, solving problems, and they don't realize how impactful the work they're doing is. And when you just give them time, or you get on a circle and you talk about the work you've been doing, it's very validating for the person that is proposing the solution or the response themselves. But it's also healing for me as a journalist as well, because I feel like I'm being able to really understand where that person's coming from, what are their concerns, what are, the limitations of the work they're doing, their context, and then sharing that. So I share those insights and that wisdom that they have been learning. And instead of feeling like I'm spreading fear and anxiety, I feel like I'm really sharing information that is helpful. And the way that we integrate that in our day-to-day is by really connecting what is our community and our editorial and even our revenue. We're thinking, how do these three things work together? And it's something that we're still integrating and making sure that with every story, there's that listening component and also a distribution component where we go back to the community, make sure maybe we do a PDF so it can be printed, and people in that community can read it if they don't have access to internet, or getting those channels, those WhatsApp channels where we know everybody is and they can share it, or, getting the emails from the people of the community. Or in one case, I did a video and we went back and screened it at the Vieques Human Rights and Film Festival. And that was such a magical moment because I could hear them cheering themselves on, seeing themselves on screen. So I think it creates a lot of satisfaction and fulfillment for everybody involved. And we're always thinking, well, when we're asking for a proposal, what's the community engagement aspect of here? How much of the budget we should allocate to community, not just to the story production, because we want to start by listening to the people involved and making sure that when we're investigating from the questions and the needs of the people who we are covering.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that going back is a critical part that's often overlooked. And I think it's a really key component to meaningful local journalism, this commitment to ongoing coverage, to going back again and again. I think it's particularly important when it comes to climate disasters. So many outlets cover the immediate aftermath and then move on. So at this point in our conversation, I want to bring in Katie to talk about her experience covering climate disasters in an area once thought to be a climate haven. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit, how you address these hard realities of climate change at times when people are really, really suffering and experiencing really tragic experiences.
Thank you so much for that question, Breanna, and thank you all for having me here. Yeah, I've had the dubious honor of covering two big and several little small climate disasters here in central and southern Appalachia. The first being the 2022 Kentucky flood, and the second big one being Hurricane Helene, both as a local journalist and the second as a sort of hybrid local national journalist. But it's, I think if you look at the idea of a climate haven, and we've deconstructed that over the past couple of years, we realize it doesn't really exist, and so much of it is about not only the climate vulnerability of every place, but also the specific climate vulnerabilities that aren't just about does it get hot or do you get storms, but are about can your infrastructure withstand this? Do you have a lot of socially vulnerable people where you live who are disabled, living on fixed income, elderly, people of color, undocumented immigrants? And we found throughout Appalachia that we are like socially and infrastructurally vulnerable. And so in covering climate disaster, I've learned more and more about these vulnerabilities that we do have. I want to say that, in covering climate disaster in the immediate as a local journalist, you're not thinking about the smart angles. You're not thinking, you're thinking about service to your community, you're centering audience, you're throwing away your ego, you're sort of accepting that this is bigger than you. And so that's a lot of what you do at that time. But, when it comes to a month or 2 months, 3 months later, and a lot of the major media outlets have gone, they've done their thing, they've, come and gone out, that is when it becomes your job to really like hold local leadership to account, to get them on the record, talking about, what they're going to do to keep the community safer next time, thinking about what it means for there to be a next time. Are people accepting that reality? And just, understand that long recovery process. That's multiple years. I mean, I would say Kentucky is still recovering. People are still in the buyout process, and it's 3 years later.
Absolutely, right? These are not short-term challenges. And I really appreciated your point about, holding leaders accountable, looking at how to make sure that communities are ready for the next one, which will inevitably come. And I'm wondering if you can speak to some of the solutions as well, and the ways in which mutual aid organizations or communities themselves are coming together and identifying the problems and coming up with some of those solutions internally.
Absolutely. I mean, it's sort of like this very interesting interplay of community groups, government, individual, like disasters are so murky and there's so much going on. And it takes time for leadership in various places to emerge. I would say like something that I found over the course of covering disasters for the past 3 years is that I used to romanticize the sort of community involvement, the mutual aid groups that do step up. They do people build bridges for each other. People, open up their churches to their, community. People open up their homes to displaced neighbors. But, ultimately, I just remember watching leadership come in and praise people's the words that were often used were resilience and grit, and that's words that leadership loves to use in Appalachia. And I would just think to myself, okay, but this isn't all we're gonna need. Like, this isn't gonna cut it. We can't mutual aid our way to a new highway when like I-40 fell into the river. So I think really thinking about how are community groups doing that real help? How are communities self-organizing? What can we learn from that? Things like community, solar microgrid kind of hubs that, are really incredible. And then also are what do we need from leadership, right? Beyond that, beyond praise of that, beyond support for that, what resources do leadership need to bring in? And so that's really your long-term job, is to make sure they're bringing in those resources where they can.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think another really interesting aspect of this type of storytelling is the need to sort of humanize these disasters, talk to individuals to show their individual experience. But I think that sometimes that comes across as, this person made a bad choice to live in a floodplain, for example. And it turns into this unintentional victim blaming for things that are actually pretty far outside an individual's control. I wonder if you could speak to this idea of making sure that you are telling human stories and showing these individuals as agents of their own lives, but also making clear that these are systemic challenges that are not the result of their individual choices.
Absolutely. I think that's part of the beauty of the climate beat, right? Is that we're looking at the structural impacts of climate change rather than looking like one disaster to another. And I think we can treat, communities that way too, where, the reasons that someone might be living in a trailer in the floodplain are many. That might be a generational home, that, their great-great-grandparents purchased that plot of land and they're still living on it. It's been subdivided in their family and it's not worth very much. So it's hard to leave. Or, it's just hard to leave your home. So I think, having empathy for that and understanding, I think, as a reporter, I try to sort of base myself around the idea that people are intelligent, people are not stupid, people are lacking information. And so thinking about what is the information this person or these people who are in this situation didn't have, what are the factors that led to them being where they are, and having really empathetic conversations. And also I think just trauma-informed reporting is so, so important when it comes to disaster, and sort of knowing, accepting the fact that perfect interview, that person you were chasing, that particular person, for their experience and the role they could play in your story, that person doesn't want to talk to you, and you know what? They're going through a lot. That's okay. You find somebody else, and that kind of thing, and just being willing to be human yourself and accept, your sources as human as well, and treat them accordingly.
I love that emphasis on people's humanity. And I think it really gets at the heart of why we're doing this work, right? Like, what do we hope to accomplish with local coverage of these disasters? Like, I think most of us would agree we're not trying to entertain or just provide disaster porn for audiences who are not in those areas. So I think a big question that I'd like to throw to all three of you is, when looking for stories, it can be about what is happening or what isn't happening, right? What infrastructure is there or what infrastructure is missing. The leadership and climate action that is taking place or that isn't and that needs to be. So I think I'm going to start with you, Emilie, and I know you had spoken specifically about climate action plans. And I'd love to hear your thoughts and experience about, the stories that can be gleaned from a community that does have an action plan or that doesn't have an action plan. How do you use either the presence or absence of these structures to find important stories that do serve the community and the people living there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think that for me, the climate action plans have been sort of a way to help me organize the information and the stories that I gathered through the listening exercise, because you have what scientists are saying are the effects of climate change in your specific community. So in Sacramento, you have extreme heat or you have flooding. And then you also, if you're going to think about things through the solutions lens, you also have to know and understand what your community is, what are the biggest contributors to pollution and greenhouse gases. And those two things are two kind of separate ideas. And if in my case, I really wanted to write climate stories that the reader in our community could take in, and then it would be actionable. And so as I was listening to all these various examples of how people were both affected by climate change, and also how, what people's work lives, living where they lived, how that was contributing to climate change. For example, in Sacramento, one of the major things is we're sort of a commuter city. So we have a huge amount of single occupancy vehicles. We are expanding highways, all of that. And so in order to take what I was hearing and make sure that I wasn't just chasing down a story because it was maybe the most interesting to me or the best story, because the story for me has to have some utility, I used the local climate action plan as a way to look at the stories that I was thinking about and see which ones were the most important as far as addressing climate change and what we could do at the local level. That said, Sacramento did not have an enacted climate action plan. So it was a commission. The city had a commission work on a climate action plan. They had presented that plan, but it was not enacted. So that it didn't really matter to me whether it was enacted or not. It was information that I could use as a reference to look at what I was hearing and what the science, the best local science was saying. And I know there's other cities or towns that don't have climate action plans. Usually the county will have something, or even the state will have something. So even if your local area doesn't have that, I'm a big proponent of looking for the best available geographic research that can tell you what is going on in your community, so that you take the lived experience, but also the scientific piece of it and try to meld those two.
Yeah. And you also had shared earlier with me a story that an intern of yours did that I think really demonstrates an interesting way, kind of a backdoor into finding interesting story ideas and interesting collaborations. Could you share a little bit about that story and how it came to be?
Yeah, so I think that one of the things about the way I'm thinking about local journalism that touches on solutions and addressing climate change is expanding the story to touch people who are not necessarily the expected people in those stories. And so this summer I had a wonderful intern, Callista Otama, and they were really interested in science. And so we're fortunate here in Sacramento, we have UC Davis just down the road from us. And one of the things that caught Callista's eye was this research study on how an increased diet of anchovies was affecting Chinook salmon locally because they were depressing thiamine levels or raising thiamine levels. I can't quite remember that detail, but basically what caught Callista's eye was that the research paper had something like 23 authors, and it also had school children, and it had just anglers and really unexpected people were listed in the authorship of the study. And they got interested in finding out how that happened. And what it turns out is that for this study, they engaged all these people to help them give them information that the scientists wouldn't have been able to gather on their own. So the solution story became about bringing in, it wasn't necessarily a good story for the salmon. The salmon are in distress and endangered, but the approach of people coming together, which I think is, I don't know, one thing that gives me hope about about addressing climate change. I think we need to come together. This story became an example of that, and also opened up Callista's reporting in her world to talk to all these different people that might not have normally made it into a story about a study.
Yeah, I think it's a great example that, you know, even these things that seem like dry scientific research papers, like there is so much community, there is so much creativity, there's so much collaboration that comes out of these situations. I'd like to go to you next, Camille. And I think Puerto Rico has an interesting relationship with leadership and the roles that colonialism has played in really shaping the infrastructure and the ability to adapt and recover from these climate disasters. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the way that you sort of balance accountability and community empowerment when there are so many factors coming into play in the aftermath of these disasters.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of reflect something that Katie said about this word resiliency, and how after a disaster, I feel like especially parachute journalism or people from, you know, outside the community really weaponize that term resiliency to bypass the responsibility of government. And what happens a lot is, you know, we talked about that focus on tragedy and victimization, and not really talking, well, how has colonialism affected Puerto Rico's ability to really be resilient, you know? And almost the term in Puerto Rico is hard to use because we're just very triggered by it, you know? So I think the context is the key here, you know, to get to know not only we love to center agency and how people respond to the problems and how they are taking matters in their own hand, and at the lack of a national Puerto Rico-wide mitigation plan, well, they're creating their own contingency plans, and they're creating their own solar grids and their, you know, their own solutions. But it's really important to contextualize that response in the structural issues that they're facing. And can that solution scale if they're not getting the investment? Can that solution scale if the government doesn't also take up the responsibility to widen the scope, right? So I think that's the key there, just to balance the solution with the context of structurally where that solution is placed, so that way you don't romanticize, right, people's response. And also because then that kind of calls you know, it holds people accountable. And it also, for us, we're thinking of the 63% of Puerto Ricans that live in the diaspora and that can use that information to advocate in US Congress for better relief, right? So that's really important there, to have that whole context.
Absolutely. I think the role of federal government can be really tricky to know how to address in these stories. And Katie, I know that you've mentioned a lot of confusion or conflicting feelings about FEMA, for example, in the aftermath of these disasters. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how you address it in your stories, and how you communicate about this accountability and responsibility to your readers who have a real stake in these recovery efforts.
Yeah, and I want to start out by giving a shout out to my team at Blue Ridge Public Radio and also folks at Grist, because storm recovery is so long and it is so huge, and there's so many agencies and so many different flows of money. It's pretty impossible for one person to do, and so we all kind of take a bite out of it. But in tracking long-term recovery, it is really important to familiarize yourself with these agencies that, you know, sort of, we all feel lots of different ways about them, but they are the place that the money comes from. FEMA, Army Corps of Engineers, coordinates a lot of debris cleanup. That's a pretty gnarly process that often it's causing a lot of upset in Western North Carolina right now for a number of reasons, and that's become a very important story to follow. Or, you know, the way that the state interacts with the federal government, the speed at which the state is reimbursed, counties are reimbursed. Like, there's just so much, and it's not always fun. It's not always sexy. You know, it's definitely not as not as dramatic as the initial, you know, disaster reporting, couple of months, 3 months or so following, but it means so much for, you know, the future of what it means of the community you're in, and how it will respond to the next disaster, how it will be affected by the next disaster. Will debris jams, you know, cause more flooding? You know, next time there's a big flood, will the forests that are less resilient now because there's been tree blowdowns, like, will that affect the wildfire season? Like, there are all these sort of like complicating factors to follow, and I think it's an interesting moment to think about the federal, state response, because it is so contested. You know, this is a moment where it's sort of become a political hot button. The question of this federal response. So I think a needle I'm still trying to thread is like, what does it mean to be critical of federal response while understanding the continued need for recovery resources, and like threading that needle. So lots of questions to ponder.
Absolutely. These are not simple issues to report on, that's for sure. And we're having this conversation at a moment when local journalism is facing a lot of real threats. I'm thinking about public media and the federal funding that's just been clawed back. And this work is a lot harder to do without the necessary resources. So I'd like to talk about how your teams have been able to pull this off with limited resources, and what challenges that brings. So let's start with you, Emilie. What extra challenges exist when resources are tight, or when you do have the resources you need, what has that enabled that wouldn't have otherwise been possible in your local coverage?
Well, one thing that comes to mind is when I undertook this project, our environmental reporter had just departed. So I came into the project thinking that I would have a reporter to tie to it, and then that wasn't the case. But in some ways, that was a really kind of driving force, and it helped me innovate, because the whole goal had been to help the entire newsroom be comfortable and adept at reporting and incorporating climate change into their beats. And that was what I wanted to do, and that sort of added even more impetus to making that happen. So every story in the project was written by a different reporter, which some of them had some experience writing about climate and environment. Some had very little experience. And so the challenge was also, I guess, one of the things that made the project special to me was that I got to work with different reporters. I think the part that maybe was added more pressure and work and things that I had to think through was basically making sure that I had wrapped my head around everything that I was hearing and what our community really was up against, so that I could help guide the reporters, and then just negotiating with their editors for the time and and the space to get these stories done, because they were not necessarily, it took a few days to get all the reporting done, and then also making sure that the shape of the story was right. So I don't know. I think for me, most of the time, the limitations are also something that can drive the project forward. So that was my experience with it.
Yeah, and presumably having tried their hand at one climate story, maybe they feel more capable and empowered to do more climate coverage, which is a win-win. Absolutely. How about you, Katie? What has funding allowed or prevented in your reporting?
Well, let me say during the Kentucky flood, I was the only reporter at my station. And during Helene, I was one of a team of about 10. So that was night and day. It is, and the thing is, you have to understand as a local reporter covering a disaster, you're just going to miss stuff. You have to accept that. Live with the regret, do the best you can. But you miss so much less when you have a team and are able to sort of buoy each other up, build trust, collaborate, send people out to cover a briefing while you have to go ground truth something, somewhere else. It means so much to have like a full team. And I'm just like, I always think, I'm like, what could we have done with 20? What could we have done with 30? In terms of resources that were helpful to us at the time, we got a lot of editorial support from other stations, and that was really, really great. We're at a time of, really tight budgets in public radio, as many of you know, but it's also a time when stations have really been coming together to support one another, send resources. In my previous station, people sent us equipment because we had lost all of our equipment in the flood, as well as losing parts of our community. So that kind of thing, that sort of mutual aid between outlets is so vital in those instances.
Absolutely. And last but not least, Camille, you have a pretty involved role with fundraising and figuring out how to kind of find the resources needed to do the kind of reporting and outreach you want to do. I'm wondering if you could talk about that a little bit and how you think about fundraising, because I think it's a little different than a lot of newsrooms.
Yeah, for sure. It's obviously sometimes funders are looking to fund the product and not necessarily the process. But we have found it that showing in your pitches or in your proposals that your idea comes from community can help get that funding. And at the end of the day, like, our value proposition is our connection to community. And I think for most local independently owned news outlets, that's the proposition, right? We are connected to the community. So what's important for us is to look at those other outlets or the other media organizations, the funders that appreciate that and that want that, because they are out there. It has been the Solutions Journalism Network, the Center for Health Journalism in UC Annenberg. I know the American Press Institute also has a big component of community engagement, Altavoz Lab. Like, there are people out there that want to support that connection. So it's important to identify them. And also, even if sometimes people are not outwardly talking about it, they do still appreciate knowing that the idea already kind of has an audience, because if your idea comes from something that community members want, then you already have people that are interested in those stories.
Absolutely. That built-in audience can go a long way. We do want to open it up to Q&A, so please do share your questions with the Q&A function. The first one here is a simple one, hopefully. Noella Boudart is asking the name of the project that Emilie has been talking about, and if there's a link for us to view. Would you mind sharing that in the chat, Emilie, for folks who aren't familiar with your coverage? And then I'm going to jump to the second question. This, I think, applies to all three of you if you each want to take turns answering. But Morgan McFall Johnson asks, it sounds like major disasters are the main vehicle for talking about climate change in your newsrooms, and rightfully so. But does climate change come up in other unexpected ways? Did you learn anything that surprised you in your listening sessions?
I can take a stab at that one, and say that, I cover Appalachia as a whole, and while I'm based in Western North Carolina, I cover other parts of the region, and I do cover the coal fields of Eastern Kentucky, and Southwest Virginia and West Virginia from time to time. And that, that's where we really start to talk about not just disaster, but also extraction, the impacts of fossil fuel extraction, and the real part it's played in the economy and sort of the hole that it's been leaving. And so that's also, these are parts of the region where talking about climate change, saying even those words, can be really taboo and very very like politically charged. So you have to find ways to communicate about it, communicate about its impact, and also understand, the hole it's left in people's lives, in their livelihoods, and sort of report with empathy on that. And once again, not victim blame, not be like, why do you want coal back? That's so silly. But rather, oh, like your grandfather and your father had a union pension, paid for by their work in the coal mine, sent their children to college on it. Of course you miss it. So I think that's another really interesting climate reporting challenge, is to think about how to report on climate change for and in communities that depend on fossil fuel extraction or have in the past.
I'd just like to say that, I think one of the problems that the news cycle has is, like, sometimes we feel people only care about Puerto Rico when there's a hurricane, right? That's when all the news outlets want to report on it. But we're facing the climate crisis every day. And for example, Hurricane Erin didn't get to Puerto Rico, but I was without power for a day, and it came and it went off, And so we are always facing these issues. So I think something that needs to happen is, yeah, we need to care about the climate crisis every day, because it affects us every day. And I do think that something we also talked about is that long-term reporting, because we are still recovering from the 2017 hurricanes in Puerto Rico. It's been almost a decade and we're still recovering from that. So I think also the long-term recovery and the returning to the story and seeing how things have changed is also really important.
I'm just putting together a quick Google Doc that I can share in the chat with all the stories, because interestingly, I don't have an individual landing page. So I'll get that in the chat just shortly. But I think one of the things that the question was about, like, what surprised you in listening, right? So one of the things that came up for me as I was talking to different groups or different individuals, I had reached out to United Latinos, and they actually recommended that I talk to one of their young organizers who work directly with just their local constituents. And she was actually a volunteer, and we started talking about different efforts in California to limit greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the things that she started talking about was how she saw on Reddit and on message boards people complaining about gas leaf blowers. And her father had been, his first job in the US was landscaping and gardening. And now he owns a company where he employs people who many of their first jobs in the US are landscaping and gardening. And her comment was, I can see how people complain about this, and California is phasing out gas-powered lawn quick care equipment. And she said, but at the same time, no one wants to pay more for their lawn, so they want us to transition, but they don't want to give more. And so that was sort of what I was left with. And it was her frustration, and I was then trying to come up with how do I think about this in a through a solutions lens. So I think there's times where people are really good at articulating solutions. I also think that there's often I myself can be more articulate sometimes about a problem than a solution. And so one of the challenges in listening is, not being, working with the problem, but not always expecting people to have the solution, and trying to still find a way to generate something helpful and useful to the community.
Yeah, I think that idea of being helpful to the community gets to the heart of our next question from Leonie Joubert, talking about how, as we go into this more extreme and unstable future, how do we just not report on an event, but ensure that communities get the information they need to prepare, respond, access resources? How does that show up in your reporting, or how do you think of how that fits into your larger reporting?
Yeah, I can talk about that. I think service journalism is so important. One of our best performing articles a few years ago was how to recycle your batteries. It's so simple, but people don't know where to take them, right? And the same thing with other types of, okay, well, how do you access, for example, I know Katie had talked about accessing those FEMA dollars, or how to access, or how do you prepare? So doing service journalism that just focuses on guiding people is very low lift, because it's not as complicating as doing, these investigative stories, but they're super useful, like, because they're super SEO friendly. Like, people are looking for those questions and they find you. And what I would encourage too, not only putting it digitally, but creating PDF versions that organizations can print, so people who don't have access to, Wi-Fi, or who may not find you online, can read that in different places. It could be restaurants, or it could be different small businesses. So that's what my suggestion would be, to not only keep it digital, but think about, how can I create this in a graphic that we can share in messaging, or that we can print out, and that it could be used as a resource beyond the digital world, especially if the power goes out and there's no internet or power, then you can have something that people can access physically.
I'll jump in as well to follow up, because that was really most of what we did at Blue Ridge Public Radio after Helene. We were told by our editors, Laura Lee and Anna Douglas, to really sort of throw aside our egos as reporters, not look for the angles, not look for those big ambitious stories, but just give information to our community, sort of in the spirit of public service. And so that's what we did. We had a live blog up that was continuously updated, where people would go to find the latest information. Our hosts broke format and were sort of like a comforting presence as well for people who didn't have other sources of information because internet was spotty. Our incredible audience engagement manager, Stephanie Rogers, started a text service because it was hard sometimes to open up web pages. So, the essential information, like where water, food, gas, where FEMA was setting up, all of those things were texted out. Our water was, Asheville's water was off for about 53 days, or like it was off for a while, and then it was not drinkable for about 53 days. So, sort of updates about the water went out via that service. And also Grist's community engagement person, Lindsay Gilpin, also did incredible work with me. We identified housing as a big concern after the storm, and so put together some information on housing, tenants' rights. So these things, like Camille said, sort of having your audience's information needs inform the work you do, and really just continuing to center them and find ways to reach them is really vital.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it reminds me about a concept I know that you've written about, Camille, this idea of post-traumatic growth. And I think it's really helpful to think about the ways in which, journalism can provide the information to meet immediate needs, and it can provide the information for communities to think about bigger picture, what changes need to be made. So I wonder if you could speak a little to that concept of post-traumatic growth.
Yes, so post-traumatic growth is a concept that I learned from a Puerto Rican researcher, Isabel Unanue. But it's a concept that already existed, but she did research after Hurricane Maria to investigate if there was that growth after the disaster hit here. And I was kind of fascinated by it because we hear a lot about PTSD and we feel it whenever we see, a phenomenon coming out in the Atlantic Sea. Everybody kind of like gets tight and anxious. But there is also it can happen that after a disaster, communities can come together and become stronger, become more organized. And that's something that we have seen and we have covered, for example, how communities have used participatory design to plan their own water systems or their own microgrids, and how that not only makes them more resilient, but also there's this concept of anti-fragility, which means that actual storm can make you stronger, right? The way you respond when the next one goes, you are stronger after. And infrastructure wise, that has happened at the community level. Nationally, I wouldn't say that we are stronger or more resilient because our general electric grid is super delicate. But socially, the reality is that I do think that the disasters that we've been through in the past almost 10 years have made us more organized. And even if we lack investment to get the infrastructure we need, we are very abundant in solidarity. And ultimately, that's what is going to help us survive when the next disaster comes. Because now, all these organizations that respond short-term and long-term are connected. And that's really important.
Thank you so much for that. I think it really shows the ways in which a lot of these solutions need to take place at the community level, right? Like they're not necessarily scalable larger than that. And so much of the goal of solutions journalism is to show these local solutions so that other communities can see and adapt and replicate them in their own communities. I'm wondering if Katie or Emilie, you'd like to sort of end on a note of an example of a community solution that you have reported on that has been replicated, or a way in which you are committed to this solutions journalism model because you see that benefit to the communities that you are serving.
I feel like I've been talking a lot, but I can let's say something quickly. I think I don't want to, once again, romanticize this, but I think I've seen, particularly since 2016 in the Appalachian region, like people just know what a disaster looks like, right? So there's just like a sense of, when people need, there's a period where you need clothes because everyone's lost their clothes. And there's a period where people all have all their clothes back and they need other stuff. They need their Similac, they need, baby materials, diapers, all this stuff. And then, people start to need building materials. And so we've started to learn regionally what those phases are, and seeing these like regional networks of distribution, just ordinary people like communicating about these things, sort of hubs developing in certain community centers, churches, etc. Sort of becoming formalized in some ways, less formalized in others. But I think it's been really inspiring to just see people like beginning to really understand and learn how to help each other survive.
Wonderful. I think that is a beautiful note to end on. We are so grateful to all of you for attending and asking great questions. Thank you to our three panelists for having such insight to share with us. We just shared the links in the chat for the essay on the power of local journalism that Emilie contributed to the Climate Blueprint, as well as the link to the larger Climate Blueprint project. As we mentioned at the top of this hour, this is one of a series of webinars we're doing related to this Climate Blueprint. We'd love for you to continue to attend and contribute to the evolution of this project. Thank you so much, Camille, Katie, and Emilie. It's been such a pleasure to have this conversation, and we hope that everyone has left with some ideas or inspiration for their own journalism going forward. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.